limited number of. We've started. We've begun. We've only just begun. So today we start the second half, the significant half of the last unit. And I just loaded this. This is lymphatic system and immunity. I will load the Marie PowerPoints. This is the Welsh Whole PowerPoint that we're using. And it's very good for what we are covering today, which is mostly lymphatics portion. I'll show you back here where I added it here. So unit 3, here's your 1220B, and I have added that. So you have this, and the lymphatics PowerPoint's already on there. It's not a big deal, so to speak. But I have a very good immune handout I will show you that's already on. And then this is what we're starting with here. And it's basically, it's covering the same material that you would find up here, so to speak. And so some years ago, you can see this is the code I did when I did this. And I did this before I taught it. When I taught it at CCAC. This is way back 23 years ago with an older edition. So some of what you will see, and it's the same thing we're going to discuss anyway. Some of what you're going to see, I haven't really gone over and checked it for spelling, but you will see periodically, and I saw some as I scrolled through before. So it hasn't changed, but you'll see it alluding to certain figures, and ignore that. The chapter numbers have changed over time and things like that, or figures or displays or tables. You don't have to bother with those. You'll see them because the textbook hasn't changed that terribly dramatically. Except, it's like things that we know more about how it responded, let's say, to HIV than we did 20 years ago or so. Would be an example. But this is real. I spent some time. There's a dozen pages of it for you. Use it. It's good stuff. It's much more detail. I have found that what I'm going to include on the test, I've had to modify that over time. But we're just going to repeat all these things, and it doesn't include necessarily what we're going over today. We will, even though we'll probably not get through the entirety of the lymphatics today. We will surely start the immune system Wednesday. So that's the introductory nugget, and we get back to where we are here. Fair warning. Over the years I've been teaching this for more than 25 years. I've been teaching immune system for a whole lot of different places. It is always the one that the students have the most trouble with. So we're confined. The exam covers two sections: the blood vessels, blood vessel physiology, which we just completed, and a little bit of the anatomy with that, and the rest is immune system. So it'll probably be to the order of twice as much on the immune system. So and lymphatics are part of it. If there's such a thing as the anatomy of the immune system, it's what we're starting today, the lymphatics. And there's only a couple of areas, and there's some errors on the PowerPoint as we went over it. I had not previously looked at this PowerPoint. I like to get an opportunity to be amused by what I see there sometimes. It's always fun. So what are lymphatics? Lymphatics are a different system that have the ability to open on one side, which is different than what capillaries and the blood vessels are like. Blood vessels effectively a closed network. We start at the heart, we end at the heart. Are there areas where stuff can get in and out? Sure. But effectively, when we say it's like a closed circuit. Here, it's all of these start at those in the middle, associated with all these capillary beds, with very, very limited exceptions. Like we don't see lymphatics in the brain. But those capillary beds basically all lead eventually to a system we call the lymphatic system, all the way up through lymph nodes, which your mom and my mom called swollen glands when they were swollen, all the way back until they finally their fluids are joined with, their product, so to speak, is joined with the superior vena cava and eventually to the heart. So it's not starting at the heart and ending at the heart. It's starting at the tissue and basically depositing this accumulation of fluids and materials into the circulation system to make its way into the heart and then be distributed. And really, it involves, the system itself has a lot of cells, has a lot of structure, not nearly as complicated as other systems for that reason. And so basically, they help with your circulation. They take the heavy stuff. We ended the last chapter, if you can remember back to nearly 2 weeks ago on the Wednesday, where we talked about edema. Basically, there's a kind of edema we call lymphedema. So that edema we were talking about previously had to do with something blocking the fluids, or the heart or the kidneys having a problem causing it, or from an injury. This is different. People can get lymphedema from diseases of the lymph. The most famous disease of them all happens to come from a bug bite in Africa. Is called elephantiasis. And those particular parasites make their way into lymph nodes, damage them, and block them. And gravity and the fluid will make a person over time and make their leg look like an elephant's leg. That kind of same general appearance. It's there, hence the name elephantiasis. So they're really a helper of the circulatory system because capillaries are designed, they have vessels that are easy to damage. They're designed to pick up fluid, basically fluids and stuff dissolved in fluids. When it comes to fats or proteinaceous or protein-laden things, or viruses or bacteria, or moreover, bad cells, be that as cancer cells or transplanted or transfused cells, they travel by way of the lymph. The lymph is really, if you will, the circulatory arm of our immune system. So not only does it assist the circulation system, blood vessels, capillaries, etc., it's really the sort of the anatomical arm of the immune system, and how these bad guys, whatever their source be, either acquired from the outside or from us because some mistake in metabolism or some mistake in the cellular level, how we identify and respond to it. So there's really probably a limited number of questions on lymphatic anatomy and the lymph system. So I don't want to de-emphasize it, but I want to clarify it more than anything else. I've been 10 days away from using big words. I went to withdrawal. The dog was a Camp Owl. I couldn't lecture the dog. Show him pictures of the lymphatic system, and he's looking. He'd be bored. And I'm getting the same response out of many of you, the ones of you who are still awake. Smile, Grace. These are the jokes. Thank you. So, transports, this is what we call interstitial fluid. Fluid that it can't get back into the capillaries, and it's kind of stuck there in the spaces where the capillaries dropped off a lot of stuff from those spaces and returned to the bloodstream eventually. Think of it this way: the stuff in there is too thick; it would clog up the capillaries. If they block, now you have damaged circulation. Now that would lead to another kind of edema as well. It absorbs fats, particularly when we see it in the digestive system. When we get to these tiny little finger-like projections in your small intestine, they have a fancy name. They're called villi. Villus means finger. And each one of these fingers are like little nubs in your small intestine. They have a lymphatic vessel. They have a lymphatic capillary. It's got a famous name that you're going to need to remember for digestive. It's called a lacteal. As you can see, it's here, Lacteal. And lastly, and as important as anything that it does, it's your defense against disease. It's your defense against infectious diseases. It's your defense against diseases that were infectious and invaded cells. It's your defense against irregular cells that you've either acquired or formed. In the way, again, of cancer cells, transplanted or transfused cells. When we get to the immune system, there's a very significant distinction on how it works. There's one line of white blood cells that makes antibodies, and there's one that attacks cells directly. And that's very, very important. That's really the crux of understanding immune. It's whether you're using something called the B cells. The big B stands for bone marrow, and the big B is part of antibodies, the way I think of it, and the other ones are called T cells. And T cells, because they undergo change in the thymus, that's where the big T comes from. And they specifically attack might be the wrong word, interact when there are abnormal cells that were invaded by a bacteria or a virus. Cells that were cancerous cells and broke off and started to travel, transplanted cells, transfused cells, all this. There's so much to it. And why the system is so important, because the best thing when your immune system is working fine, guess what? You don't want to know about it. You'll have no idea. You won't have the sniffles. You won't have a headache. You won't have what I have here, a clogged ear, because I'm having a little, typical allergies are starting to rear their ugly heads. No. You'll know nothing. And that's the best thing possible. When it's working, you don't want to need it. If you don't know about it, you don't feel anything's out of whack. The worst thing can happen is when your immune system goes wacky. And when it goes wacky, it has a very, very bad habit of forming things that attack healthy structures. It'll form antibodies that attack you or attack your cells. It can make deposits of materials that will damage cells and damage tissues. We call that phenomena autoimmune, the body attacking itself. It is not good. Diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, MS, systemic lupus erythematosus, diabetes type 1, they are all in the category of autoimmune disease. They're nasty. So the immune system refers to the fact that many cells of this lymphatic system are defense against disease, and I take issue with the word permanent. I'll tell you the same thing. Immunizations, if they are effective, provide, I would say, long-term immunity would be a fair way to describe it. But permanent suggests that you're never going to get it again. It's typically not the case. There are a few. Like as a kid, I had the measles. They didn't have an MMR shot. I got the measles. I didn't get the mumps, and I got the chickenpox, which is rubella. So MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella. When I got married and we were getting ready to try to start a family, I got a mumps immunization, which was available 1978 when I first got married. And because the MMR and the different components had become available. Did I ever get the measles again? No. Did I ever get, because I never had an immunization for them. So if you want to say that's permanent, maybe you can buy it. By and large, our immune system is funny. When it starts to falter, things that you might have been previously immune to can be big problematics. My kids all had chickenpox. I'm sure all of you had whatever the chickenpox immunization was. Okay. It doesn't. My kids thankfully all survived chickenpox, but the reality is that all of you, whether you had the immunization or like mine had the chickenpox, so everything's good. 1/3 of you are going to get the shingles. You don't have to thank me. It goes with the territory. Statistic. So that you might be permanent against chickenpox, but not against what chickenpox are when they recur, the shingles. That. So the PowerPoint is, as my dad would have said, talking through its chapeau, talking through its hat. So you and I would use another anatomical area. Oh, you're awful. How are the banks? How are the Outer Banks? Yeah, I bet you it's cold. I was going to say, first thing. Chilly. Yeah. There were some cold areas. Yeah, I was watching the guys playing golf in Florida. They're in the morning. They're wrapped up pretty good. And the wind's howling about 30 miles an hour. That did not look like a golf day to me. So they're showing you all of these capillary beds are right there of these lymphatics. They're in that same area. That's where they're active. And as you'll see, collectively, they all go to the same spot. Eventually, they lead to the superior vena cava. It's not the anatomical nature of this system. They start with what are called lymphatic capillaries, tiny little lymph buds. Lymph vessels are here. They lead, and they're associated with nearly all the systemic capillaries. They lead to lymph nodes. They form larger trunks. And eventually, there's two areas where they're collected that eventually dump into or lead into the superior vena cava, one on the right and one on the left. But they're asymmetrical. The one on the right is called the right lymphatic duct, despite what this PowerPoint would have you believe, which is totally incorrect. So I want to point that out to you. The right side, the right half of your head and neck, and your right upper extremity, and your right upper torso, the right thoracic area, they all drain, and that's the term we use. Their lymph drains into what's called the right lymphatic duct. All the rest of the lymph, both lower extremities, your entire abdomen, the left side, your whole left upper extremity, left side of your head, neck, chest, all of those areas drained by something called, and to the left side of the superior vena cava called the subclavian vein. Maybe in your blood vessels you learned that the subclavian vein and the jugular vein on each side came together and basically formed something called the brachiocephalic veins, and the two brachiocephalic veins came together and formed the superior vena cava. See, I would pass that test. I'm in class, doofus. My goodness. I have the same name for him I have for the dog. Doofus. It's a bit of a doofus, starting a new job. So here's how it starts. Capillaries, vessels, lymph nodes. And again, the lymph nodes you're going to see are a series of stations where this lymphatic fluid, rich in stuff that we may not want to deal with and may cause us problems, filter through at the lymph nodes. And by filtering it through, we're able to identify if there are any bad guys. Okay? Oh, God. Just give me a second. All right, and so it works its way through all of these things, collecting the subclavian veins in the thorax, and it will work its all the way up. And so we'll look, the capillaries, they're closed-ended. I would have rather said open-ended, and you're going to see this. It's like you'll see an illustration. It's like it looks like a closed vessel, but it has little flaps that when there's pressure is increased, when there's more fluid, it'll cause, and you'll see the illustration, it'll cause these little clefts to occur, and the lymph gets kind of sucked into them. All right. So these capillaries, relatively thin wall, because they pick heavy stuff up, and thin walls, interestingly, can stretch a little bit because it's thicker stuff. Simple squamous epithelium, nothing fancy about that. It enters these capillaries. Once it's in there, we call it lymph. And that's what lymph is. Lymph is, we all have it. Again, it's the heavier and thicker stuff that would clog regular capillaries. And so we pre-process it and return it to the general circulation in a very wide blood vessel, such as the superior vena cava. And so this is what they're trying to show you. They're sort of intertwined or embedded with all of these things that are there. So similar to veins, but thinner. Okay. Don't worry so much about the lining. Yes, there's a little elastic tissue and a little smooth muscle. As they get, it's just like any blood vessel. As they get larger, they get more layers, and they have some connective tissue. That's a very similar arrangement to a typical venule and then a vein. And yes, just like venules and veins, what do they have? Valves. And the valves are there to ensure, because they rely on the same thing that veins do. There's not a lot of pressure to push it back to the heart. It relies on breathing, the mechanical action of your muscles in your ribs and your abdomen and your extremities. As they're moving, they're squeezing, they're compressing and pushing that fluid along, and the valves prevent it from backflowing down. That's all they do. And along the way, there's a series of these way stations, so to speak, called lymph nodes. So they're showing you, this would be an example of a valve that's in one of these. And the way that the little flaps are, as the fluid goes this way, okay, so it doesn't go back down to your foot or back down to your hand, then the valve doors effectively close, and so it goes up a segment at a time. or multiple segments at a time. And so they all go for and we name them for the particular region. They don't have fancy names. Okay, not going to get into that. It's not a big deal. Okay, and the collecting systems drain the lymph from a whole area. The thoracic duct, the larger one. Again, the vast majority of the body. And the reason I put the name up there, in digestion, you're all the stuff, once it gets through your stomach, we have a name for all the food that's partially processed, partially digested. It's called chyme. We'll get to that in digestion. CHYME. When we talk about lymphatic fluid is named chyle. So in the old days, these were older terms. So you hear, the reason I always mention terms that you might think are a little old or archaic, because you might hear them in a hospital. So chyle means lymph, chyme means all that sort of food that's in the midst of being processed, so eventually you can absorb it and utilize it. So one of the areas in your abdomen where the vast majority of it comes in is called the cisterna chyli. You'll remember a cistern is another name for a well. It's just a collector. And all of that empties into the left side by way of the subclavian vein. You'll see the illustration. This is where the error is. Not that the lymphatic duct is smaller, it does not begin in the left thorax. It begins in the right thorax. It does empty into the right subclavian vein, and it drains the right side of the head, neck, and upper thorax, and right side thorax and right upper extremity. So this is a total misprint. Ignore it, please. This is showing you where all these lymph nodes are. There's large accumulations in area based on proximity to where invasion could occur. Tremendous amount in the groin or inguinal area, here and here. Because the most common source, there's three really common sources of infection. Okay, skin, because that's where a lot of infections get in through little openings in your skin, like hair follicles and sweat pores. Respiratorily, number one source of infections, genitourinary. The other area. So where we have accumulations of lymph nodes, the inguinal area, the underarm, particularly because of breast and breast-related problems, particularly breast cancer, in the abdomen, okay? And then for the respiratory ones, here. All these chains that are in front of your ears and behind your ears and your neck. The stuff that when you had a cold or a sore throat, your mom's squeezing away, your glands are swollen, we better get you to the doctor. Versus, you probably just have a little virus, we'll watch and wait, open your mouth, all that type of stuff. Moms are good with that. So in our day and age, there wasn't urgent care. There was, if you went to the doctor, it cost a significant amount of money. There wasn't health insurance or anything like that. Right? So, I mean, you had to be having a near-death experience to go to the doctor. The corollary to that is good luck trying to get out of school. See, I wanted to go to school because I annoyed the teachers. I was that kid, front row, glasses, annoying, making fun of them. Are you ever sick? No. It would make your day too easy. The obnoxious kid in the front, pocket protector, suspenders, bow tie. It's a name from an old TV show, Steve Urkel. Is it ringing a bell for anybody? Yeah. Go back and look it up. Yeah. I was that kid. I don't want to be absent. I want to be here. See, and now your problem is that kid, guess what? Goes around, if they were still alive, I go back to every one of them. See? Goes around, baby, comes around. Here you go. Now, this is a better illustration. So here's roughly the thoracic duct is here. So in this area, you can see the illustration. So this is the breast. This would be the right breast, and you can see draining. And that's why when there's any kind of a biopsy has to be done for any kind of a lump where it's indicated, you always do a lymph node dissection. It's so important because it's the tail of the mammary gland goes directly to here, and if it's breast cancer, it metastasizes very, very quickly. So it's a must. A lot of times the initial slide will be negative of the biopsy. You have to wait X number of days for the slides of the lymph nodes. That's very, very important. So here's thoracic duct up here, what they call a bigger part, where the right lymphatic duct up here, draining the right side of the head and neck, the right upper extremity, the right side of the thoracic area or upper torso, and everything else, the sternochyly, thoracic duct on the left, all the lower extremity, all the left side, etc., etc. It's there. Don't have to worry about that. We're not going to do the flow chart thing. So lymph is that kind of a fluid that's there. Depends on tissue fluid formation. Okay. So there's a lot of things that make tissue fluid. And so without going too crazy about it, I mean, most of the fluid that enters is really, tissue fluid is mostly like plasma. It's just that different amounts of electrolytes and stuff that's absorbed in it. It's what's not small and what's not dissolved in the plasma that effectively becomes the lymph. So the tissue fluid that we reabsorb in those capillary beds has large proteins, even though most of them stay in the bloodstream. There's ones in the tissue for whatever reason. Okay. And so when we talk about tissue fluid, we have plasma from the blood, less the plasma proteins, but depending on the area that they're draining, there may be protein or at least peptide, which means change of amino acid like substances, and certainly large fatty laden substances. Even relatively small fatty laden substances will get in there. They don't absorb very well. So, and they go into why we have the lymph. Effectively, the more circulation to an area, you're always going to have lymphatic material. Okay. Filtration from the plasma normally exceeds reabsorption, meaning you're typically going to put out more stuff than you bring back in. So what you're bringing back in is the plasma or plasma-like substances that'll fit, and everything else has to go by way of the lymph. Okay. And so effectively by that, because there's stuff left over, it creates pressure in the tissues, and as you'll see by a subsequent illustration, it opens those little clefts I was talking about. And if there's damage to them, or there's infection, or there's disease, or there's some genetic malformation, we can get different kinds of edema. And they're talking about the one with the axillary nodes with breast cancer that are there. Let me show you the illustration here. And we'll go backwards. Here are these little clefts. They don't look like they're open, but they're open all the time. They have tiny filaments. So it's not flapping around. Here's a capillary bed, and it's like flapping around in there. It's anchored by these filaments. It's a permanent structure. And as pressures build up, the pressures will open these little avenues, these passageways, and eventually the action and the valve structure will cause the lymph to flow back centrally, going back toward the heart, toward the superior vena cava area. Eventually. In order for it to do that, one side too many, there isn't a lot of pressure to start with. So muscle activity, you don't have, we talked about it with venules and veins. There's not a lot of, you probably have, if it left the heart at 120, it's got into the veins at about 15. So you have to rely on skeletal muscles, breathing, okay, smooth muscles, eventually in the larger lymphatic vessels, just like they have smooth muscles in larger veins. We start getting to named veins, they're able to bring it back and aid the flow. And the valves play a constant role in it. And yeah, it's a whole lot better. It's not like in order to have good lymph flow, you have to work out every day. You need to be active every day. I was telling the other class, we have somebody who's not by choice, but has to be relatively sedentary. That's when we start getting consults for physical therapy at home care or in a nursing home type of facility, where you have to do something. Even if they're stuck in bed, there's things that you can do to help to limit the amount of lymph that's there. There's a lot of ways to intervene with that. You're not going to make it go away, but you're going to make it, there's going to be less there to deal with. So yeah, it's identification of these potential problems are so important for anybody who clinically interacts with people. And you don't have to be a doctor or a nurse practitioner. You can be anybody, because it could be somebody at home. If you're in a totally different field, if you're an engineer, if you're in environmental science, which a lot of the students are. I mean, you got people in your orbit. You see them. You know, grandma and grandpa can't get out of bed like I felt last night to be run around ragged by little children. Oh, come read to me. Come play with me. We have to go outside. Let's do this. And you know what I couldn't say? No. My son, Dad, go play with him. Go help her. So play a lot of role. So in order, again, these lacteals bring the fats in that we have, that we ingest, and we ingest a fair amount of them. Eventually, small proteins will eventually be returned into the bloodstream because some of them will be incorporated with the lymph. Excessive amounts of fluid, etc., etc. They summarize it fairly well. The problem is these foreign particles. And again, when we get into immune system, you're going to see the distinctions in these foreign particles. There's that illustration. Term that you need to know. I'm probably not going to ask it to. Okay, it's a very generic term. Mucosa are the moist linings at entry areas. So mucosa are associated with your entire alimentary canal. The moist linings, whether in your mouth, your esophagus, your stomach, all the way out through your small and large intestine in the anorectal area. They're the moist linings that are in the anogenital area, urethra, vagina. All of those are part of it. Respiratory areas, mouth, nose, throat, all the way into your lungs. So we call those mucosa, and they all have lymph tissue that's associated with it. We call it MALT. When it's associated with the GI tract, you might see the acronym GALT. When it's associated with the skin, which isn't necessarily a moist lining, it's a dry lining, but it has lymphatics underneath it, it's called SALT. Get the idea? The ALT is associated with lymph tissue. And so this is part of it. So collectively, and when they say unencapsulated, it means it has, and I tried to draw it here with my bad artwork, like that would be a tonsil. A tonsil in your mouth, in your throat, because it's coming in contact with respiratory, potentially infections, digestive, so bad guys from both of those systems conceivably. And what happened is they roll over whether your tonsils or your adenoids, which are really just another name for it. Basically, the stuff will come in and enter these little clefts. And then it may or may not, depending on whether it's a problem or not, have to be addressed. It may trigger a response by the variety of lymphocytes, specific white blood cells in that area. And so when they say unencapsulated, it does not have an exterior boundary with a distinct blood flow getting into it. Most of the structures in the lymph system don't have that. When we get to lymph nodes, have capsules and they have specific entry ports, you'll see shortly. The spleen, which we're not going to get to today, the liver basically functions as a lymphatic organ in many ways sometimes. So unencapsulated digestive, respiratory, urinary, repro, tonsils and the appendix are composed of very, very similar things like that. The tonsils, all what's inside that, if that's a tonsil, I'm sure they'll show you an illustration, are masses of this lymphatic tissue. The appendix, a lot of it too. It's just unfortunate with the appendix, because of its sort of spiral arrangement, it's kind of twisted. Stuff can get stuck in there for certain people. But years ago, I mean, when I was a kid, if you had 2 ear infections, they took your tonsils out. They thought your tonsils were the reason. We know now that these are immunological tissues. They're your friends. If somebody had an inflamed gut, oh my God, and they had a low fever or something, boy, we're going to get them ready for an appendix. We learned over time, you don't take that stuff out. Now, you may have had your tonsils out. That's reserved to when the tonsils get so infected that they literally become necrotic. They start to die and become a source of infection. So my eldest, the one I visited this weekend, and my daughter, who you saw the wedding pictures, they both had their tonsils out from, multiple ear infections. She had 2 sets of tubes, the usual stuff. So sometimes you get them out. But that's not, the trend changed. When I was a kid, yeah, you batted your ears twice. You end up with tonsils coming out. And another name, this is an important name. The ones called Peyer's patches are the ones we find in the small intestine. I just say small intestine. The ileum is the third and longest part. The small intestine is all basically the same. You have three, we'll get to digestive anatomy. One's called the duodenum or duodenum, that's about 10 inches long. Then you have about 8 feet of what's called the jejunum, Jejunum. And then lastly, the ileum. Notice it's got an E into it. That's because the ileum with an I is the one like the iliac crest, the bone, the ileum. So they'll probably rename it because it's so similar. You know, that's a watch out thing on a test. Ilium with an E or ilium with an I. If somebody comes up and say, "Is this a misspelling?" You know, I'll tell you whether it is or not. But other people think about that. Lymphatic organs, when it says encapsulated, the nodes, and we won't get to the thymus or the spleen today. So the lymph nodes are small. They're maybe about an inch. They're along there, and really, it's a great word, filter. You have multiple inputs. They're like a big funnel. This has multiple inputs, and all of this fluid is sort of filtering through little nooks and crannies filled with white blood cells, lymphocytes, that will address it whether or not it's something that's a bad guy that they have to make antibodies for, or a bad guy that we're going to have to make something called a T cell for. When we get to the immune system, you're going to see if it has invaded a cell, that's going to call for T cell immunity. If it has not, if it's just on a surface or floating in the bloodstream or floating in the tissue by itself, then that activates what's called the B cell line. B stands for bone marrow, but the other way to think of it is B stands for making antibodies. You're going to see that's really how the body attacks these invaders, either with antibodies or specific cells. Well, I love the name, killer T cells. It's trained assassins. Love that. Oh, I've been looking for you. Boom. See, the cell tries to reach for its gun. You feel lucky today. Clint Eastwood, he just turned 95. Try not to bore you. So lymph nodes along the vessels and a concentrated area where they're most likely to encounter problems, and they'll attack anything that shouldn't be there. And so sometimes, and they'll have white blood cells there called macrophages, which come from monocytes, and they may be just attacked right there, neutralized, and gobbled up. So lots and lots of different chains, big chain areas, cervical along your neck and head area, the axilla, beg your pardon, we discussed. Supratrochlear is elbow area, the inguinal area, pelvic, inside pelvic cavities, even in the thoracic cavity. You're gonna see when you look at the lung, there's just teeming with white blood cells that are like little scavengers. The central nervous system has a glial cell that does the job. You might remember there's 4 central nervous system glial cells: oligodendrocytes, astrocytes, ependymal cells, and lastly, microglia. They're like they're really tiny macrophage-like cells that are really designed to sweep up debris. If you get a virus or a bacteria in the central nervous system, then we're dealing with encephalitis or meningitis. And then now you're dealing with something that's got, that person's really sick and better be in the hospital. And they're just showing to you, you're going to see the diagram here. It's very, very small, and you're going to see the diagram will show it better. So it too has clusters and clusters, what they call germinal centers. That's where, so if this was, let's say, a virus, a cold virus, made its way in to one over here, it would trigger that germinal center to start the process of maturing certain kinds of B cells. Maturing is the wrong term. Activating B cells that have matured. And the reason I qualify that, this is one of the confusing things about the immune system. You're going to hear about competent cells. Competent cells are ready to fight, but when they're activated, now they're a different cell. So we talk about competent being ready, but not having been exposed to a bad guy. and ones that have been activated, which have been exposed. So what happens, these germinal centers, when they have now been exposed to, let's say, a virus or a bacteria, and they're going to start pumping out antibodies. And they do it by what's something called cloning. It's really mitosis, but we give it a specific name because now we have an active either B cell or T cell line, so we call it cloning. And you can see, and this is just showing 4, they might have 6, 7, 10 of these inputs, and with only 1 or 2 outputs, it means it's going to take a long time to sort of make its way through all these little nooks and crannies that are just filled. And the fiber that they have in there, if you go back to your AMP1 in the lab, what is connective tissue fibers? You have collagen, which are thick, elastin, which are thinner, but are stretchy, for elastic aspects. And lastly, you have reticulin. Reticular fibers are like collagen, but they're coated and they're very skinny, and they form like a fine mesh strainer. We see them in the bone marrow. This is where you see a lot of them. So it's almost like making its way through like if you used a strainer at home. Like, there's grounds in the coffee, take out the strainer and you pour it in there because the filter is one of those flapped on itself. Same illustration. And so filter out harmful particles from the blood, and really what it does more than anything else is surveillance. It's supposed to be doing its job. We're not supposed to notice. When we notice it, when we feel, oh, it's swollen there, I don't like that, or you feel something, then there's something up, because those are signs that your body is beginning to respond to some kind of invader, whether it's like me with some allergies and I'm feeling congested or along those lines, or sneezing or coughing, whatever it is, potentially. It could be minor, it could be mean there's an invader, okay? So the lymph nodes, along with the red bone marrow, the lymph nodes are centers for lymphocytic production. That's a mistake. They are born in the bone marrow. Some of them mature in the bone marrow, and again, we use the term competent, or they become competent in the thymus, which we're not going to get to today. That's different, okay? When the idea of lymph nodes being for lymphocyte production, once they are activated, that cloning is what they're talking about there. So they are not centers, they are produced in the bone marrow. And they may or may not be finalized in the thymus or the bone marrow. But when you talk about production, those are production areas. When you talk about cloning, they've been activated. Now they're going about doing they're on with their life's work. And depending on where they are, different pathogens, again, whether they're inside the cell or not inside the cell, triggers. You will see 2 different arms of your immune system. That's the hard part for students to understand. It's not all antibodies. Okay. And then sometimes if it's just a minor type of a thing, some foreign material, 1 or 2, again, your immune system is all about numbers. If it's just a couple of viral particles, it'll just neutralize them, stop them, and white blood cells will come along, macrophages, and gobble them up. That's their job. And again, we looked at this at the end last time. Lymphedema, whether something is mechanically blocking the flow, the classic one of removing them in the breast, when you have to do a mastectomy, either partial or total, and you end up removing a substantial amount of lymph nodes, then it's a very significant problem. That's one of the areas when you're talking about sentinel lymph nodes. Anybody with any practitioner, nurse practitioner, doctor, nurse, someone, when they've got the first thing you're doing in that exam, when you feel that, you feel where the lump is, you're working your way back right into the axilla. If you feel a hard spot in there, it's like, okay, you better get a good look, because that's when it's going to have to be excised eventually and examined. Okay, that's the idea. It's just unfortunate. That's what happens. That's where they're most likely to spread. And along the arm on that side of the body. And so, and this is, I told the other class, maybe I told you, the wonderful actress who's getting near the end of her career, Kathy Bates. You've seen her 1,000 things. She had a double mastectomy, I think, and really had a big problem on one side. So 6 days a week, she has to go in. They have to mechanically pump the lymph out of her arm, and she wears a sleeve, and you almost never see her in anything that isn't a long sleeve top. She goes out and acts, and then rinse and repeat the next day. I think 6 out of 7 days, because typically her work week is 6 days. And so You get exercises, it's hard to sleep with those compression sleeves. They're not pleasant. Okay, and even sometimes I'll learn to sleep with this. We used to do that with patients when we did upper extremity procedures. You have you actually hook their arm softly with different kinds of wrapping materials to an IV pole. We have a special pillow that would hold it up so we can stay elevated. So you have to do all of those types of things. This is where we stop with the other class. We'll do thymus and spleen afterwards, and then we'll go on to the immune system. I'm sure we'll be into it heavily on Wednesday. Thank you. Oy. Uh.